My stepfather smirked. "Your brother has more to lose if we let you keep the family business," after they tried to push me out, so I opened the buyout agreement and said, "You forgot I already own the majority stake." The day my stepfather tried to push me out of the family business, I was sitting at the conference table with a folder of financial statements in front of me and a paper cup of coffee I had already forgotten to drink. I had spent the previous week assuming we were going to have a difficult family meeting about cash flow. I did not realize I was walking into an attempt to remove me from the company I had spent more than a decade building. The business was a commercial flooring company my dad had started before I was born. We supplied and installed flooring for apartment buildings, schools, medical offices, restaurants, and small commercial properties. It was not glamorous. Most days involved invoices, damaged pallets, delivery schedules, insurance certificates, subcontractors, and customers asking why an installation crew was 2 hours late. Still, it had become a good business. When my dad was alive, he ran most of it himself. My stepfather, Rick, married my dad when I was in high school and gradually became involved in the company. My younger brother, Evan, worked there too. I came back to the business after college and eventually ended up handling operations, purchasing, customer accounts, and most of the major contracts. By the time my dad died, I was effectively running the company even though I did not have the largest ownership stake yet. That part came later. At the time this happened, I owned 62% of the company. Rick owned 23%. Evan owned 15%. The percentages mattered because they were the reason I never understood why anyone thought they could simply vote me out. But I did not always have 62%. That is one of the reasons this whole thing got so ugly. After my dad died, Rick became convinced that the company should be treated like a family inheritance rather than a business. He thought the three of us should make major decisions together because we were family. I understood the sentiment. I just did not think sentiment paid payroll. The business had dozens of employees depending on us. Some had worked there for more than 20 years. Our biggest customers expected us to honor contracts. A few large projects were always running at the same time. There were weeks when a single delayed payment could create a problem with payroll if we were careless. I had learned early that owning a business meant making decisions that sometimes made you unpopular. My dad understood that. Rick never really did. At least that is how I saw it at the time. Looking back, I think I made the mistake of assuming our disagreements were about management style. I did not realize there was a financial incentive underneath almost every argument. The first warning sign came about 6 months before the meeting. Rick started questioning why I had authority over the company checking account. I reminded him that I had been the operating manager for years and that our corporate documents authorized me to handle ordinary business expenses. He said he thought the arrangement had become too informal. I agreed that we should clean things up. That should have been the end of it. Instead, he started asking for copies of every transfer over $10,000. I did not have a problem giving them to him. The accountant already had them. The bank had them. Our accounting software had them. So I sent him the reports. I assumed he was just being cautious. The second warning sign came when he started asking questions about the company truck fleet. We had 6 company vehicles. He wanted to know why I had approved replacing 2 older vans rather than repairing them. I explained that one had more than 200,000 miles and had already cost us thousands of dollars in repairs. The other had transmission problems. Replacing both was cheaper than losing installation crews for multiple days. He seemed satisfied. A week later, he asked the same questions again. I thought he had forgotten. The third warning sign came from Evan. Evan and I had never been especially close. We loved each other, but we had very different personalities. I was cautious with money. He was more impulsive. I liked having plans. He was more comfortable figuring things out as he went. He also had a habit of getting overwhelmed and then avoiding problems until someone else solved them. That caused plenty of arguments between us. Still, I never wanted him out of the business. My dad had always wanted us to work together. One Saturday morning, Evan called me while I was at the grocery store. He asked whether I had been talking to Rick about selling the company. I almost laughed because I assumed he was joking. I told him no. He got quiet. Then he said Rick had been talking about the possibility of restructuring the ownership. I asked what that meant. Evan said he was not sure. He said Rick had been telling him that the company had become too dependent on me. That did not surprise me. I was not offended by the idea that the company needed more structure. What bothered me was that Rick was apparently having these conversations with Evan without talking to me. I asked Evan whether Rick had mentioned me losing my position. Evan said he had not. Then he changed the subject. I remember standing in the frozen foods aisle holding a bag of vegetables and thinking the whole thing was probably just family gossip. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, our accountant emailed me asking whether I had approved any changes to the corporate ownership records. I said no. He said he had received a request from Rick for historical ownership documents. That part was normal. What was not normal was that Rick had asked specifically for documents related to stock transfers from the year after my dad died. I knew exactly which documents those were. That was when I started paying attention. The year after my dad died, I had borrowed money personally to buy additional shares from the estate. My dad's will had divided his remaining interest between me and Evan. Rick already owned his own shares through a previous transfer. I had wanted to buy more because I knew the company was at a turning point. We had just won several large contracts. I also knew that if nobody took control, the company could easily become trapped in endless family arguments. My dad had left a small provision giving each of us the right to purchase shares before they could be sold outside the family. I used that provision. I paid for my additional shares with my savings and a loan from the bank. It was not an enormous amount compared with the eventual value of the business, but it was a huge amount of money to me at the time. I remember sitting at the same conference table where the meeting happened later, writing the check. Rick had been there. Evan had been there. The lawyer had been there. The buyout agreement had been signed by everyone. I had put the documents in a binder and never thought much about them again. That was the mistake I kept thinking about later. I had assumed the paperwork existed and therefore nobody would pretend it did not. That was naive. A few days after the accountant's email, Rick asked me to come over to the office after lunch. I found him at his desk with Evan sitting beside him. There were 3 folders on the table. Rick told me they wanted to discuss the future of the company. That phrase alone made my stomach tighten. I sat down. He explained that he believed I had become too controlling. He said Evan had been pushed into a role where he had responsibility without enough authority. I asked for examples. He listed several decisions I had made over the previous year. Replacing the vans, changing a subcontractor, hiring a project manager, renegotiating one of our supplier contracts, taking a line of credit for seasonal cash flow. None of those decisions were secret. All had been documented. All had been reviewed by the accountant. Several had actually increased profit margins, but Rick framed them as evidence that I treated the company like my personal property. I told him I understood why it might look that way. Then I explained again that I had 62% ownership. Rick did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back and smiled. It was not an angry smile. That actually made it worse. He looked completely comfortable. Then he said my brother had more to lose if they let me keep the family business. I asked what that was supposed to mean. He explained that Evan depended on the company more than I did. He said Evan had a mortgage, a family, and obligations. He said I could walk away and find another job if the company fell apart. I remember feeling confused. I was not sure whether he was threatening me or warning me. Then he said the 3 of them had been discussing a plan to force a sale of the company or reorganize ownership. I looked at Evan. He would not meet my eyes. I felt something inside me change. Up until then, I had been trying to solve a management disagreement. Suddenly, I realized I might be dealing with an ownership dispute. Rick reached for one of the folders. He told me the proposal involved transferring some of my operational authority to a management committee. He said the committee would consist of Rick, Evan, and an outside consultant. I asked who had hired the consultant. Rick said they were in the process of doing that. I asked how a management committee could be created without a shareholder vote. He said the corporate documents gave the board broad authority. I told him we did not have a separate board with independent directors. He said that was exactly the structural problem they were trying to solve. At that point, I finally opened my laptop. I pulled up the company's digital records. I asked him to point me to the document that gave them authority to remove me from operational control. He said he would provide it after the meeting. That answer bothered me more than anything else. If he had a valid provision, there was no reason not to show me. I left the office without agreeing to anything. On the drive home, I kept replaying the meeting. I was angry. Then I was embarrassed that I had not seen it coming. Then I started doubting myself. Maybe I had become too controlling. Maybe Evan really did feel pushed aside. Maybe Rick was right that we had outgrown the way my dad had structured things. I did not sleep much that night. The next morning, I called our lawyer. He was cautious. He did not immediately tell me whether Rick had a case. Instead, he asked me to send him every ownership document I had. I sent the shareholder ledger. I sent the purchase agreement. I sent the estate documents. I sent our articles of incorporation. I sent the bylaws. Then I remembered the old binder in my filing cabinet. It was the binder from the year I purchased the additional shares. I opened it and found the document I had not looked at in years. The heading was the buyout agreement. It was 6 pages long. I had forgotten almost everything in it except the basic purchase price. I started reading. Then I reread it. Then I called the lawyer again. There was a clause I had completely forgotten about. The agreement did not merely confirm my ownership. It also created a mandatory buyout process if any shareholder attempted to transfer voting control without following the agreement. There was another provision requiring any proposed restructuring affecting voting rights to be approved by holders of a majority of the outstanding shares. That meant me. There was also a right of first refusal tied to any attempt to sell shares outside the existing ownership group. I sent the lawyer photos of the relevant pages. He called me back later that afternoon. He told me the document was still valid. He also said I needed to stop discussing the matter informally with family members and start communicating in writing. That advice turned out to be one of the most important things anyone gave me. From that point forward, I kept every email. I saved every text message. I copied every financial statement. I downloaded the bank records. I made a folder containing the ownership ledger, purchase agreements, meeting minutes, tax filings, and old estate documents. I did not tell Rick exactly what I had found. I wanted to understand what he was trying to do first. A week later, I got an email from Rick proposing a special shareholder meeting. The agenda was vague. It mentioned organizational restructuring, management authority, debt exposure, and future ownership. There was no direct statement that they planned to remove me. My lawyer reviewed it and told me to attend. He also told me not to sign anything. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Friday arrived. I finished the morning payroll review, approved 2 supplier payments, dealt with a customer complaint, and then drove to the office. The same conference room was waiting. Rick sat at the head of the table. Evan sat beside him. There was another man I recognized vaguely as a business consultant. Rick introduced him as an advisor who had reviewed the company's structure. A stack of papers sat in front of each person. My first thought was that this looked rehearsed. I sat down and took out my own folder. Rick started by saying the company had grown beyond what our family structure could handle. He said there needed to be clearer lines of authority. The consultant gave a long explanation about management risk. Most of it sounded reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. They were not proposing something obviously absurd. They were proposing something that sounded professional enough that someone unfamiliar with the ownership documents might accept it. The plan would have created a management committee with 3 voting members. Rick would have 1 vote. Evan would have 1 vote. The consultant would have a non-family vote. I would report to the committee. My authority over contracts and spending would be reduced. The committee would also have approval rights over major hires and financial decisions. I asked how this was supposed to work given my majority ownership. Rick said ownership and management were different. Technically, that was true, but the bylaws still mattered. I asked whether the proposed management structure had been approved by the shareholders. He said the meeting was for that purpose. I asked how they expected to approve it if I voted against it. That was when Rick looked at me the same way he had at the first meeting. He seemed almost amused. He said they believed the company needed to protect Evan's future. He said Evan could not afford to be pushed out or left with a minority stake in a company controlled by someone who might eventually sell. I told him I had never proposed selling. Rick said intentions changed. I asked Evan whether he agreed with the plan. Evan finally looked at me. He appeared uncomfortable. He said he was scared about what would happen to his income if the company became unstable. I told him I understood. Then I asked whether he had been told I was planning to sell. He said Rick had mentioned that possibility. That stunned me. I had never discussed selling with anyone. I asked Rick where he had gotten that idea. He said it was just a concern. That was the moment I understood the strategy. They were not trying to prove that I had done something wrong. They were trying to create enough fear around what I might do that they could justify taking control away from me. I stayed calm. I opened my folder. I pulled out the buyout agreement. I laid it on the table. Then I pointed to the ownership schedule. I reminded them that I owned 62%. Rick had 23. Evan had 15. I explained that the buyout agreement also required majority approval for any restructuring that materially changed voting rights. I said I had not approved the proposed committee. I also explained that the agreement prevented a shareholder from using a restructuring to circumvent the existing voting structure. Rick's expression changed. He looked at the pages. Then he asked why I had brought that document. I told him because it was the agreement that established my additional shares. He said the agreement was old. I said old did not mean invalid. He picked up the document and started flipping through it. The consultant asked whether there had been an amendment. I said not that I knew of. The consultant asked whether the company had ever formally updated its shareholder register after the transfer. I handed him the register. My ownership was recorded correctly. There was a long silence. Rick finally said the agreement was being interpreted too broadly. I told him I was not interpreting it. I was reading it. That was the first time I saw real anger on his face. The meeting ended without a vote. Rick said they would reconvene after their attorney reviewed the agreement. I walked back to my office. I closed the door. Then I sat down and stared at my desk for several minutes. I was relieved. I was also sick to my stomach. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was an ownership fight. The next thing I did was review the company's finances more carefully than I had ever done. I wanted to know whether Rick had a legitimate concern I had missed. I went through accounts payable. I checked the line of credit. I reviewed tax filings. I examined the receivables aging. I looked at payroll. Nothing showed a crisis. The company was profitable. Cash flow was tight in the normal way. We had a large amount of money tied up in projects that had not yet been completed, but there was nothing that suggested the business was in danger. Then I noticed something strange. There had been a transfer from the company account to a vendor I did not recognize. It was not huge. It was a little over $8,000. The description in the accounting software said consulting services. I asked the bookkeeper about it. She said Rick had asked her to enter the payment. I asked whether there was an invoice. She said there was. I asked for a copy. The invoice was from a consulting company I had never heard of. The address on the invoice was a private mailbox at a shipping store. That made me uncomfortable. I sent the invoice to our accountant. He told me the payment had been authorized by Rick under a management expense category. That was technically allowed. Still, I wanted to know who the consultant was. I looked up the company through the state business database. The owner listed on the filing was Rick's cousin. That did not automatically mean anything. Family businesses hire relatives all the time, but I checked the date the company was formed. It had been created less than a month before the first payment. I felt my stomach drop. I asked Rick for an explanation in writing. He replied that the company provided business advisory services and that the relationship was not relevant to our ownership dispute. I forwarded the response to my lawyer. He told me to keep documenting everything. A few days later, I discovered another payment. This one was larger. It was for legal consulting. I had not authorized it. The invoice described work related to corporate restructuring. That was when I realized the money was being used to fund the very effort to reduce my authority. I did not confront Rick immediately. Instead, I checked the corporate records. Then I checked the bank access logs. The transactions had been approved under Rick's existing authority. Nothing was criminal about that on its own, but the pattern mattered. I was paying, through company funds, for an effort to take control away from me. I asked the accountant whether that could be considered a conflict of interest. He said it might be, depending on what the money was used for and whether the expenses primarily benefited the company. My lawyer gave me similar advice. He also said that accusing someone of fraud without enough evidence could make the situation worse, so I did not accuse anyone of fraud. I simply documented what I knew. Around this time, Evan started acting differently. He stopped coming to my office. He sent more messages by email instead of talking face to face. One night, he called me while I was making dinner. He sounded exhausted. He said Rick had been telling him that I was preparing to sell my shares to an outside investor. I told him that was false. He said he had seen a document with my name on it. I asked what document. He did not know. He said it had something to do with a sale. I asked him to send me a picture. He never did. The next day, I checked the company files. There was no sale agreement. There was no letter of intent. There was nothing. I later learned that Rick had shown him an old valuation report from a bank loan. The document listed the estimated value of my ownership interest as part of a hypothetical sale scenario. Evan had misunderstood it. I was angry at Rick for using it that way, but I was also angry at myself. I had avoided these conversations with Evan for years because I thought work and family should stay separate. That had made it easier for other people to fill the silence with their own explanations. I called Evan and asked him to meet me for coffee. I did not bring the lawyer. I did not bring documents. I just talked. I told him what I knew. I explained that I had no plan to sell. I showed him the shareholder register. I showed him the buyout agreement. I told him I was not trying to take his shares. I also admitted that I had made mistakes. I told him I had sometimes made decisions too quickly. I told him there were times I should have included him more. I told him that owning the majority did not mean I was always right. He listened. Then he admitted that Rick had been telling him for months that I was preparing to force him out. That was the first time Evan understood why I had been so confused. Both of us had been hearing different versions of the same story. Rick had been talking to each of us privately and making each of us afraid of the other. I left that coffee meeting feeling worse emotionally but better practically. Evan was no longer automatically aligned with Rick. That changed everything. The next Monday, Rick sent notice of another shareholder meeting. This time, the agenda included a resolution removing me as president and appointing Rick as interim president. He also included a proposed resolution authorizing the company to sell certain assets. My lawyer told me that the asset sale language was a major warning sign. If they could not gain control through the management committee, they might be trying to create financial pressure. I prepared for the meeting. I printed the shareholder register. I printed the buyout agreement. I printed the corporate bylaws. I printed the meeting minutes showing prior management decisions. I printed the accounting report on the consulting payments. I also prepared a timeline of ownership transfers since my dad died. I did not plan to make a dramatic speech. I just wanted the record to be clear. The meeting began quietly. Rick looked more serious than before. Evan sat with him but did not appear comfortable. Their attorney joined by video. My lawyer joined too. The first 20 minutes were procedural. Then Rick's attorney explained the argument that I had breached my duties by making unilateral decisions. He cited several transactions. My lawyer responded with the documents showing those decisions had been authorized under the existing bylaws and had been disclosed to the shareholders. Rick's attorney then focused on the idea that majority ownership did not automatically give me absolute management authority. Again, that statement was technically true. I did not object to that. I objected to the proposed removal process. The discussion went back and forth. Then Rick's attorney mentioned the buyout agreement. He said their interpretation was that it governed transfers of ownership but not internal restructuring. My lawyer disagreed. He pointed out the specific section requiring majority approval for any transaction or restructuring that effectively transferred voting control. The discussion became much more technical. I mostly listened. Then my lawyer asked Rick whether he had approved the payments to the consulting company. Rick said yes. My lawyer asked who owned the consulting company. Rick hesitated. Then he admitted it was his cousin. Evan looked at him. I could tell that was news to him. My lawyer asked whether the company had received a written deliverable from the consultant. Rick said there had been strategy discussions. My lawyer asked whether there was a written report. There was not. Then he asked whether any of the consulting invoices related directly to the attempt to alter my authority. Rick said some of them did. At that point, the room changed. The issue was no longer just about whether I was too controlling. Now there was a question of whether company funds had been used to finance a personal ownership dispute. Rick argued that the restructuring benefited the entire company. I understood his point. That did not make me agree with it. Then Evan spoke. He said he wanted to know whether he was expected to vote against me because Rick believed the company was at risk or because Rick wanted more control. Nobody answered immediately. Rick told him it was about protecting the family. Evan asked why none of this had been discussed openly before. Rick said because he did not want conflict. That answer hurt more than I expected, because the conflict had already happened. We had just been dealing with it indirectly. The meeting was adjourned without a vote. 2 days later, Evan emailed me. He said he wanted to review the ownership records himself. I agreed. We met at the office with the accountant present. We went through the history of the company. He saw exactly how I had purchased the additional shares. He saw the money trail. He saw the bank loan. He saw the old checks. He saw the shareholder ledger. He finally understood that my 62% was not something my dad had simply handed me. I had paid for it. That mattered, not because I thought payment made me more deserving than him. It mattered because Rick had been describing the ownership as if I had somehow taken something that belonged equally to all of us. The documents told a different story. A week later, Evan told Rick he would not support removing me. That was the moment the plan collapsed. Rick could not pass the proposed resolutions without Evan. More importantly, he now knew that I was not going to be pressured into surrendering control. The lawyer-to-lawyer communication continued for several weeks. There were discussions about a possible buyout. At one point, Rick proposed buying my shares. The price was far below what the company was worth. I declined. He then proposed buying Evan's shares and leaving me with a minority stake. That was impossible because the buyout agreement gave me rights in any proposed transfer. My lawyer sent a formal response. We also required the company to stop making payments to the consulting company until the shareholders could review whether those services were legitimate corporate expenses. That finally forced Rick to provide records. Most of the consulting invoices consisted of brief descriptions like ownership strategy and leadership transition. There was no evidence of substantial business work. The accountant reviewed them. A portion of the charges appeared unrelated to normal company operations. We did not pursue a criminal complaint because we still did not have enough evidence of criminal intent. Instead, the company required reimbursement for the expenses determined to be personal. Rick eventually repaid a little over $18,000. That was not the victory I had imagined. It was actually depressing. I remember seeing the repayment come through and realizing that the amount was small compared with the damage to the family. Money was easier to replace than trust. The next issue was whether Rick would remain involved in the company. That was complicated. Removing a shareholder was not as simple as removing an employee. He still owned 23%. He was still my stepfather. He was still someone I had known for most of my adult life. I did not want him sitting in the office every day while we pretended everything was fine. But I also did not want to force him out unfairly. so we negotiated. We eventually agreed on an independent valuation. The valuation was done by an outside firm neither of us had selected alone. The number was far higher than Rick had previously proposed paying for my shares. It also showed that my ownership interest was worth substantially more than he had been suggesting. Rick was not happy about the valuation. He argued that the company was worth less. The independent report showed otherwise. He eventually accepted a structured buyout of part of his shares. He retained a smaller ownership interest and gave up his operational role. The buyout was funded through a combination of company distributions and a bank-financed purchase by the remaining shareholders. It took months. There were legal fees, there were tense meetings, there were family dinners where nobody knew what to talk about. There were birthdays where Rick and I sat at opposite ends of the table. There were text messages that never got answered. At one point, my mother called me crying. She said she understood why I was protecting myself, but wished I would remember that Rick had been part of my life for decades. I told her I did remember. That was the problem. He had been part of my life for decades. I had trusted him because he was family. I had assumed family meant nobody would try to use technicalities and fear to take control from me. I was wrong about that, but I also had to admit something uncomfortable. Rick did not see himself as a villain. I understood that after we finally had one private conversation, near the end of the buyout, he told me he genuinely believed I was turning the company into something that revolved entirely around me. He said he thought I would eventually sell it without caring what happened to Evan. He said he thought he was protecting the family. I told him that I believed he had convinced himself of that. I also told him that protecting the family did not give him permission to make decisions behind everyone's back. He said he understood. I am still not sure he truly did. Evan and I slowly repaired our relationship. It was not immediate. For a while, we talked only about business. Then we started having lunch again. Then we started watching football on Sundays like we used to. The first time he came to my house after the dispute, he apologized for believing the things Rick had told him. I told him I had made mistakes too. I had kept him out of too many decisions. I had assumed that because I was carrying more responsibility, I was automatically doing the right thing. That was not true. He admitted that he had sometimes resented me. That hurt, but it also made sense. I had been making decisions every day and then expecting everyone else to trust me. Trust does not work that way. It has to be maintained. The company itself got healthier after the ownership dispute ended. We tightened the corporate governance rules. We created clearer approval limits. We established a formal conflict of interest policy. We made every shareholder agreement easier to find. We moved important records into a secure shared system. We required written approval for related party transactions. We also established a rule that any major ownership change had to be reviewed independently before anyone could vote. Those changes were not exciting. Nobody made a dramatic speech about them, but they probably saved us from another disaster. A few months after the buyout, I received the final payment notice. Rick no longer had a management role. Evan had increased his ownership slightly. I remained the majority owner. The company was still profitable. We were still paying employees. Customers were still calling with problems about flooring deliveries. In other words, life had become boring again. That was the best outcome I could have asked for. There was no giant courtroom victory. There was no police raid. Nobody went to jail. There was no humiliating public confrontation. There were just documents. There were meetings. There were lawyers. There were bank records. There was an ownership ledger. And there was an agreement everyone had signed years earlier. The thing that still bothers me is how close I came to reacting emotionally. When Rick first told me that Evan had more to lose if they let me keep the business, I wanted to slam my hands on the table. I wanted to accuse him of manipulation. I wanted to tell him exactly what I thought of him. If I had done that, I probably would have made the situation worse. Instead, I went home. I found the paperwork. I called the lawyer. I checked the financial records. I saved the emails. I let the facts build the story for me. That is the part I wish I could explain to the version of myself who thought family arguments could be solved with one honest conversation. Sometimes they can. This one could not. The more I learned, the more I understood that the argument had never really been about my management style. That was just the explanation that sounded reasonable. The real issue was control. Rick believed control should be shared equally because we were family. I believed control should follow ownership and the agreements we had made. Evan was caught in the middle because he was afraid of losing his income and afraid of disappointing Rick. None of us handled it perfectly. That is probably why the whole thing felt real instead of simple. There was no one moment where everybody suddenly saw the truth. It happened gradually. A payment I did not recognize. A consulting company connected to my stepfather's family. A conversation with my brother. A request for old ownership documents. A meeting notice. A lawyer asking the right question. A 6-page buyout agreement sitting in a binder I had forgotten about. The funniest part, at least in hindsight, is that the document Rick apparently assumed I had forgotten was the document that protected me. He had seen me sign it. He had been there when I paid for the shares. He had watched the ownership change. But over the years, the paperwork had become less emotionally important than the family relationship. I think that is how people get into trouble. We remember what we intended. We forget what we agreed to. One of the last things my lawyer told me during the whole process was that the safest way to handle a family business was to assume everyone loved each other and still put everything in writing. I used to think that sounded cold. Now I think it is the opposite. Clear paperwork gives people fewer reasons to argue about what someone supposedly promised years ago. It keeps misunderstandings from turning into accusations. It protects relationships because it reduces the number of things people have to remember differently. My mother still has a difficult relationship with Rick and me because of everything that happened. She tries to keep family events separate from business. I understand. Evan and I agreed that we would never use the company to pressure each other in our personal lives. We also agreed that if one of us ever wanted out, we would say so early and handle it professionally. Rick eventually moved on. He started doing consulting work. Independently, we are polite when we see each other. We are not close. I do not expect us to be. For a long time, I thought that meant the whole situation had ended badly. Now I think it ended honestly. Sometimes the strongest position you can end up in is not having everyone like you. It is knowing that nobody can rewrite what happened. The company survived. My relationship with Evan survived. The employees kept their jobs. The customers were never told the full story. And I stopped feeling like I had to apologize for protecting something I had worked for. A few months later, we had an annual shareholders meeting. It was uneventful. We reviewed the financial statements. We approved the next year's budget. We discussed a new warehouse lease. We talked about health insurance costs for employees. Then we signed the minutes. I remember looking around the conference room after everyone left. It was the same room where Rick had told me my brother had more to lose. The same table, the same chairs, the same boring fluorescent lights. I thought about the folder I had brought to that first meeting. I remembered how nervous I had been. I also remembered how quickly the room had changed once the ownership records came out. The papers had not shouted. They had not threatened anyone. They had simply existed. That was enough. I no longer think of that day as the day I beat my stepfather. That framing would make it sound like a game. It was not. It was the day I learned that staying calm is sometimes more powerful than being right as loudly as possible. I also learned that being the majority owner did not mean I could stop listening to the people around me. That part was harder to admit. Evan had legitimate complaints. I had legitimate authority. Both things could be true. I spent a lot of time thinking about that after everything was over. I started holding quarterly meetings where Evan could raise concerns before they became bigger problems. I began sharing more financial information with him. I asked the managers for feedback before changing certain procedures. The company actually improved because of it. That surprised me. I had spent so much time defending my right to run the business that I almost forgot the goal was to run it well. Today, I still keep the buyout agreement in a fireproof file. I also keep a scanned copy in a secure digital folder. I review our shareholder records every year. I make sure every major agreement is current. I do not do that because I expect another family betrayal. I do it because I learned what happens when everyone assumes the paperwork will take care of itself. The other thing I do is talk to my brother, not about ownership, not about percentages. Just normal things, work, bills, his kids, my house, football, groceries. The stuff that feels boring until you realize boring is exactly what you wanted all along. Rick once told me that I had become too attached to the business. Maybe he was right. But after everything, I think being attached to something is different from being willing to lose your principles to keep it. I would have sold my shares for a fair price. I would have worked out a management structure that made sense. I would have accepted criticism. I would have even stepped back if the company needed a different leader. What I would not do was surrender ownership because someone had convinced my brother that his future depended on taking mine. That was the line. And once I understood where that line was, everything became much easier. The last time I saw Rick before he moved out of the office, he stopped beside my desk. He looked at the file cabinet where I kept the corporate records. He smiled and said he supposed I would never forget that agreement again. I told him probably not. That was the end of the conversation. No dramatic apology, no final confrontation, no perfect closure, just two people who had spent years thinking they understood each other realizing they probably never did as well as they thought. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had not found that folder. The answer scares me. I might have panicked. I might have agreed to a management committee just to keep the peace. I might have signed something without reading every page. I might have spent a fortune fighting over an ownership structure that was already settled. Worst of all, I might have believed the story that was being told about me. I might have started asking myself whether I really deserved to control the company. That is the part I find hardest to explain. Manipulation does not always feel like someone attacking you. Sometimes it feels like someone presenting a reasonable explanation for why you should give up something you worked for. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern. Sometimes it comes through another family member you love. Sometimes it sounds like protection, and sometimes the person doing it genuinely believes they are helping. That does not make it harmless. It just makes it harder to recognize. The reason the facts eventually won was not because I was smarter than everyone else. I was not. I just stopped arguing from memory. I stopped trying to convince people with emotions. I went back to the documents. The bank records showed what I had paid. The shareholder ledger showed what I owned. The buyout agreement showed what we had agreed to. The invoices showed where company money had gone. The meeting records showed what authority existed. And once all of that was on the table, there was very little left to argue about. That was the real payoff. Not getting one over on Rick. Not humiliating him. Not making Evan choose sides. It was having the ability to sit at that conference table, open the agreement, and know exactly where I stood. I had been afraid of losing control of my family's business. What I actually almost lost was my ability to trust my own understanding of what had happened. The paperwork gave that back to me, and for all the money the dispute cost, that was probably the most valuable thing I got out of it. I still have the old coffee cup from that first meeting in a box in my office. It is a cheap cup with the company logo on it. I kept it without really thinking about why. Every once in a while, I see it and remember that Friday afternoon. I remember how certain Rick looked. I remember Evan refusing to look at me. I remember the stack of papers in front of everyone, and I remember opening that binder. For years, I thought the most important thing I had done for the company was buying the additional shares. Now I think it was keeping the documents. Because when my family tried to turn a business decision into a question of loyalty, I finally learned the difference between being someone's family and being someone's business partner. The first one is emotional. The second one has paperwork. And when those two things collide, the paperwork is usually what tells you where you actually stand.